change the things I can, and the wisdom I pray each and every day, the wisdom to know the difference. Oh, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom I pray each and every day, the wisdom to know the difference.
Whoever you are and whoever you love, you are a beautiful and equal child of God and a beautiful and equal member of the living family of all souls, and you are welcome here. Come, let us worship together. The words for our chalice lighting are from Reverend James Stoll, a Unitarian Universalist and the first minister from an established denomination to come out publicly as gay, which he did in 1969. Reverend Stoll was an activist for civil rights and civil liberties generally, and in coming out, he spoke these words, which are just as relevant today. If the revolution we're in means anything, he said, it means we have the right to be ourselves without shame or fear.
Welcome to All Souls Church. I am Sherry Gilbert, serving as this morning's worship associate. Welcome to a community where our search for spirituality and our passion for justice meet and mingle, where our head and our heart are divided no more, where music is an expression of our joy, prayer, a sign of our faith, and acts of justice, a symbol of our hope. Welcome to a place where when we say all souls, we mean it. A place where all people of all races, abilities, creeds, sexual orientation, gender identity, where all people are welcome at the table of love and fellowship. Welcome one and all. I would like to especially welcome any newcomers to our community, those joining us for the first time. We hope you'll stay afterward for coffee hour to meet and greet new and longtime friends. Now, as a symbol of the welcome and love embodied in our name, All Souls, let's take a few minutes to behold one another. Although you will continue to be on mute, we set aside this time to see each other's faces, to greet one another in the chat, and to be in community together.
Few announcements for the good of our order this morning. Our fall suite of adult spiritual development offerings are up on the All Souls website. There's a wide diversity of opportunities, a course on how to revive and optimize your resume if COVID has led to job loss or job change, a series on Eddie Glaude's new book, Begin Again, and so much more. Some of the courses have limited space and are filling up, so be sure to check out the website and sign up if interested. Also a reminder that our monthly Vespers service is this Wednesday, starting at 7:30 p.m. A couple things about today. There's still space available in this afternoon's Read Project phone bank, and Spanish speakers are especially welcome because we're doing calls in both English and Spanish to voters in Virginia. Check out the homepage to get connected. And finally, today we'll start coffee hour immediately after the worship service on this same Zoom call. So you can take a break, visit the restroom, grab some coffee or tea, and then stay right here for some informal fellowship time. Moving now to our pastoral concerns. Today is National Coming Out Day, which is especially important to mark because earlier this week, several justices of the Supreme Court attacked the decision that cleared the way for same-sex marriage nationwide. It was a sobering reminder of how many people's rights and lives hang in the balance right now, not just related to marriage equality, but to the full range of rights and freedoms and equality that every person deserves. And so we offer a prayer of love, care, and solidarity with the LGBT community. Also, we join in solidarity with activists in Minneapolis and elsewhere who were angered and dismayed this week when Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with George Floyd's murder, will be allowed to leave the state of Minnesota under updated bail conditions. This and other threats of hatred and violence, the kidnapping plot in Michigan and elsewhere, are also a sobering reminder of the work we have to do. Here at All Souls, we mourn the death of Alex Zanoli at the age of 90, who died at the age of 90 on September 28th after a brief illness. For 25 years, Alex was the longtime partner of All Souls member Nadine Dutcher. So our hearts are with Nadine and her and their extended family at this time. And the celebration of life for Will Hayes will take place this coming Saturday, October 18th at 2:30 via Zoom. The link will be on the All Souls calendar. Please join me in prayer. Spirit of life, God that is known by so many names, we start by offering our gratitude for those who came before, the courageous souls who were willing to declare and claim their identities publicly. Our world is better and stronger because of the risks they took. We pray as well for everyone today in this congregation, in this country, and around the world who cannot live openly in the fullness of who they are. Our world is diminished by the need to conceal and withhold our true selves. And finally, we pray for our future, for everyone's future. There is so much at stake now. Dear God of love and justice, help us hold our compassion as well as our anger. Help us hold our outrage and our anxiety. Help us hold our hope and our fear. And dear God, help us remember that we are not the first and we shall not be the last to live through challenging times. Help us remember the courage of those who came before. Help us as we rise to meet the challenges of our time. Amen.
Greetings, members and friends of All Souls. It is so good to be with you and so good to see your faces this morning. It started, where else? On the internet. I should know better than to engage with people on the internet, but I just couldn't help myself. A friend of mine who would identify as a progressive and liberal thinker wrote a post comparing the current disregard for the public health and safety with the philosophy of Ayn Rand, or Ayn Rand, I think is how you pronounce her name. So for those of you who may not know or about her philosophy, Rand valued unfettered self-interest above concern for the common good. So he and I were exchanging posts about those who disregard wearing a mask or doing social distancing because it impinges on their personal freedom. But as part of the capstone of his critique of Rand, he called her probably the worst word that you can fling at a female identified person, a word that reduces a woman to a single body part. I posted on the thread, I said to him, you know, you can condemn Rand's philosophy as greedy and self-centered, but please do not call her by that name. It diminishes you and it demeans all women. Well, he was immediately offended. In fact, as is so often the case on Facebook, others began to pile on, some in his defense, others in mine, until it reached this fervid pitch. And finally he said something like, "Oh, stop your pearl clutching. This is not about you. It's about Rand and her philosophy." I've never been called a pearl clutcher before, so I had to look it up. One definition is outrage or dramatic protest, especially from a woman, caused by something the person perceives as vulgar, in bad taste, or morally wrong. With this comment, I stopped the debate. I sat back, took a deep breath, and tried to parse out my feelings. Because until this point in our relationship, my friend and I shared many of the same values. He believes in feminism and is raising 2 daughters. He's posted publicly about his support for Black Lives Matter and LGBTQA&I concerns. So this, I wondered, pearl clutching? Really? Well, the theme for this month, as you may remember, is paradox, or living in the both and. And in many respects, last week's sermon by Reverend Rob Keithan and mine today are like 2 bookends that are holding up some of the ways that All Souls is exploring this theme of paradox and living in the both and in our worship services and in small groups and in our social justice work. How do we live in the both and when we ourselves may be feeling so polarized? Well, there are a whole lot of books that Reverend Rob and I have both been reading and thinking about that are sort of standing between our bookend sermons. But here's a perspective from one that I came across recently. It's by Ezra Klein, and he published it in January of this year, and it's entitled, "Why We're Polarized." And in the book, Klein writes this, he says, quote, "There is much awry in American politics. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization." And then a little later on, Klein goes on to introduce a familiar concept that politics is not just shaped by our ideological beliefs, but by our very identities. He writes, quote, "When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it is not because they are making an appeal to a higher power, but because they are making an appeal to our bedrock identities. He continues, "If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, it is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune, end quote. So when I challenged my friend's use of a misogynistic word, it was no longer a philosophical argument about Rand. I suspect what stung was that an important part of his identity, that of a feminist man who cares about the lives and status of women, was challenged. And I think that's why he reacted so defensively. And that's another reason why it's so difficult to navigate relationships with people whom we know and care about, but whose political beliefs may be so different than ours. So that leads me to the second part of the title of this sermon, Pounding Sand. It was not a good week on Facebook, because on that same week, I was engaging in a conversation / debate with a friend of mine from high school who was liberal way back in the day, but as he's aged, his views have gone 180 degrees, and now he's a political conservative. And he posts political stuff almost daily, getting his news from Breitbart and Fox News and other media whom he trusts. So as I argued with his posts, which supported the president's politics, one of his friends piled onto the conversation and said, "You liberals, go ahead, keep pounding sand. It's not going to change my mind or the next election. We win, you lose, haha." I had never heard the phrase pounding sand either. So after looking that up, it meant exactly what I guessed it to mean: to engage in a pointless, menial task. I just had to laugh. Indeed, engaging with those who don't share my beliefs sometimes seems like a pointless, menial task, because it wasn't just about our differing political opinions. It went deeper than that. So I thought about something that Klein wrote a little later in this book, which was, quote, "What we are often fighting about in American politics is group identity and status. Fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Over the past 50 years, our partisan identities have merged with our racial, religious, geographic, ideological, and cultural identities. Those merged identities attained a weight that is breaking our institutions and tearing at the bonds that hold this country together," end quote. Now, I do want to acknowledge, first of all, there's a really important conversation held between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates, which do get a chance to look at it, to hear the full weight of this critique. But I have to say, although there's much about Klein's perspective that I appreciate, I don't agree with him that the weight of our merged identities is breaking our institutions. Because what he sees as a breakdown, I see as a breaking open towards an even greater freedom to allow the multiplicity of our complex, messy, merged identities to coexist. The freedom, liberty, justice for all that is the promise of democracy is still an unrealized dream of the beloved community, because we, as a people and as a nation, have not truly experienced true freedom. In fact, we cannot even really imagine it yet, what that freedom would look like, with all of our identities, our multiple, complex, infinitely fascinating identities, fully participating in the public square without fear. So at this point, I allowed myself to imagine a world in which we could fully live in the both and. So just imagine with me, just kind of play with me for a minute. What if, for example, a gun-toting, NASCAR-loving, straight white male was to discover that he actually likes to wear pink skirts instead of cargo shorts? What if he could do that without reprisal? What if a trans person can walk down the street in whatever expression of fabulousness they are feeling that day without derision or fear of violence? What if a queer person of color who is a poet, a veteran, an activist, a churchgoer, a financial planner, a fiscal conservative, and a social progressive could testify before their city council and bring all of those identities into the room because they have shaped the person that they've become? I would argue with those who dismiss identity as a purely liberal or progressive construct, because our identities, as Reverend Keithan said in his prayer, do matter. Our intersectional selves shape us. We know diversity is part of the larger plan because we see it so clearly in nature. We are all so much more than even the sum of our parts. The ability to hold this extravagant diversity in our minds, in our culture, and in our politics is what we are afraid of because we cannot yet imagine it, nor can we imagine how it might change us. Part of the fear that is in the country and culture has always been a struggle about identity and power, whose identity is allowed to dominate in the public sphere and whose identity is suppressed. Okay, so now I got to get real. I got to take it to my life and to your life, because if I want to hold in my head the possibility of that extravagant diversity becoming real in the public square, then I've got to make room in my heart for both the pearl clutchers and the sand pounders. I've got to somehow make room for my Breitbart follower friend from high school. And if I'm really committed to living in the both and, then I've got to practice the paradox myself. This is where it gets hard. This is where it gets difficult, even painful at times, because we as human beings have not yet figured out how to settle our differences without war or rancor. And the best tool we have is the democratic process. And democracy is an imperfect both and. We can all believe in settling our differences with a vote, but then one side wins, one side loses, and then maybe 4 years later, the tables are turned and there are different winners and different losers. It can seem like a never-ending pendulum swinging over a pit of partisanship. We finally take things to a vote because it's a lot better than murdering your opponent or banishing them to Siberia. At the same time, we, the people, are striving to realize yet another way of living in the both and, where perhaps new solutions to old polarized points of view can be realized. I'm encouraged that there are new and different models, both for organizing and for being activists in the world, that are being born even as we live within this polarized time. Dr. David Camp's Voice Project trainings, described by Reverend Keithan last Sunday, is one such model. And there's a new generation of activists and writers, poets, pundits, philosophers, our alternative strategists who are creating a different narrative of how we can be together in this world in new ways. People like Adrienne Marie Brown and her work on emergent strategy that are permeating organizing strategies during this election. But what about our model? The model we live in and work with and support week in, week out, year after year, for now 200 years. I'm talking about the model of church. We have this church as a model. Why church? Because this is the place where At the center of all of our paradoxical and diverse identities, we find the best expression of who we are together and who we're striving to become. A diverse, spirit-growing, justice-seeking community. We grow our spirits in this church by living in the paradox of the both and the not yet. We strengthen our justice-seeking muscles in this church by the ongoing practice and disciplines of prophetic witness and faithful presence. We deepen our souls in this church by the ability to live in the creative tension of paradox, often accused of just clutching our pearls and sometimes feeling like we're doing nothing more than pounding sand. And yet, deep down, we are convinced that in our worshiping and our marching and our speaking out and our singing, whether in our sanctuary or in the streets, we are demanding the change we can envision, and we are seeking to embody that change in the community we create. These weeks leading up to the election and beyond, they are going to test every last nerve, every breath, every fiber of our being. In the next couple of weeks, the ministry team and staff and I will be engaged in conversations about what may happen in the days just before, the day of, and just after the election. And we will be involving you in that conversation when appropriate. But I can already feel the tension rising in me, the breathless desire to ensure that the election goes the way I want it to. But should my candidate win, I do not intend to gloat over the loss that my high school friend will be feeling. I hope instead to acknowledge that loss and try again and again to see how we might rebuild this country together. I'm not naive. It may not be possible for us to reach across the proverbial aisle. But we keep at it, he and I. God knows why sometimes. But maybe it's because I also know he is more than a MAGA hat and I'm more than a chalice pin. It doesn't sound like much compared to the task of rebuilding a country, but it's a start. And paradoxically, it may be the best way to start. Whatever happens post November 3rd, I hope, as we said 2 Sundays ago during Yom Kippur, that we will all be ready to begin again. It may not exactly be in love, but it may be we begin again with hope and with faith in the future we build together. May it be so.
Last Sunday, I dialed into All Souls from Pittsburgh, where we were visiting my oldest child. When I first attended All Souls really live in 2009, I had a son, 10 years old, and a daughter, 8 years old. I now have a daughter and a son in birth order speak. You see, my kids, now 21 and 19, are transgender. Anakin, he, him, 19 years old, started his transition from female to male almost 5 years ago. He came out at the closing session of his Our Whole Lives classes. I can still picture it. Kids going around the RE room for introductions and him jubilantly announcing, "I'm Anakin, he, him," throwing out his arms, kicking up his legs in the air, all the kids clapping and celebrating with him. He was so brave and so young. Mara, she, her, now 21, came out to her dad and me just 1 year ago. She came home from college that weekend and told us separately, first dad and then me. She and I were walking in the forest, as she calls the woods behind our Glover Park neighborhood, and I can still picture it. At a bend in the path, stopping, turning to me, saying, "Mom, do you know what I'm about to tell you? I'm transgender." Mara and I attended All Souls the next morning, and she was thrilled to come out to Reverend Hardy's and also to Eileen Findley, Mara's OWL teacher 7 years previously. Thank you, All Souls, for providing a safe space to help my children prepare for their whole lives. Thank you for providing a supportive and loving space for them to discover and herald their true selves. And that's why I support All Souls. Thank you, my loving, encouraging, and caring spiritual home. On the screen and in the chat, you'll find a link to be able to give in real time. I hope that you will give as generously as you can. This morning's offering will now be collected.
And hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in awe. Keep with the web of creation your vow. Giving, receiving, as love shows us how. Wake now, my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now, compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now, my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place.
These closing words are by the Reverend Joseph Cherry. He writes, if we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be bold enough to step into our discomfort, brave enough to be clumsy there, loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. May we, as a people of faith, be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving. May it be so.
We come from the fire, living in the fire, go back to the fire, turn the world around. We come from the fire, living in the fire, go back to the fire, turn the world around. So